templates.
Gotcha. Okay. How long do I have, by the way? I think we have an hour, right? Is it scheduled for an hour?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, perfect. I want to make sure I don't go over that and leave time for questions. So I'm not going to be looking at chat or anything. So if any questions are typed up for chat, let me know and I can address those at the end, or whatnot. If someone has a really pressing issue, feel free to stop me and ask a question. But there's a lot to get through. So without further ado, this is not working. Here we go. This is a React crash course for Sitecore Dinosaurs. So I was inspired to put this together because when I joined Sitecore, I was not at all ready for where Sitecore was going whatsoever. So I spent some time kind of modernizing. I spent my first 6 months at Sitecore kind of getting up to speed and modernizing my development toolkit, so to speak, with some newer technologies, and React was one of those. So having never done it before, I found it was pretty easy to learn and get started with. So I put this presentation together to hopefully help out. So prior to this, prior to this year, I worked with Sitecore primarily as an MVC, backend developer. So I spent 10 years doing that, and before that, a bunch of business applications. So I'm kind of a traditional backend developer in the sense that I write code for the server, a lot of C#, a lot of MVC, stuff like that. So I realized that the future was coming, and I wasn't quite ready for it. So I set out to correct that. Now, being a dinosaur, that term kind of gets used with a negative connotation, but really being a dinosaur isn't always a bad thing, right? Being a dinosaur means you've been around for a while, probably. It could mean that you're at the top of your game, right? You're the big baddie. You're a manager. You're a solutions architect. You've been doing what you do so long that you're really, really good at it. Unfortunately, for some of us, like I've been saying, that's not really it feels different, right? Like the imposter syndrome is real for some of us, like myself. So now that you've been around for so long, you feel like, oh crap, I'm back to where I was 10 years ago. I feel like I just started. All this new stuff is coming out. So what do I do? So again, quick introduction. Yeah, Brandon Bruno. I have a website. I have a Twitter handle. You can reach me there. I'm based out of Atlanta, Georgia, in the U.S. I'm actually a 4-time Sitecore MVP now, but obviously working at Sitecore, I won't be able to get that anymore. But 2021 was my last award last year, so that was exciting. And like I said, I've been around for a while. I started writing code a long time ago, back in '94 on a Commodore 64 that my parents pulled out of the attic. Got distracted for a bit and played games for a while. And then around 2000, I kind of got back into software development when I got into high school and college, and eventually became this full-time backend kind of traditional developer with a little bit of JavaScript thrown in. But here in 2022, I'm thinking to myself, well, what's next? No, obviously I'm still going to be writing for the backend, but how do I get going on the next? What's next? I'm not saying that front end is the next evolution of development, right? Like it's not like you have to go from back end to being a front end developer to stay relevant, but you really need to include some of that tooling under your tool belt and be able to be good at it. So this presentation is really for the outdated backend developers, outdated, the way I feel. And ideally, this is for someone who has absolutely no React experience. If you already have some experience with React, that's okay. This will probably be a review for you more than anything, but I definitely want to cover some basics here. And more importantly, I want to make sure that you understand this presentation is meant to really help you get started and hopefully have an intelligent conversation with your peers. So this will help. Ideally, the backend developer allow them to have a conversation with their front end developers and be able to talk, converse about React and topics and architecture and whatnot. There are a bunch of other technologies at play here. Initially, this presentation wasn't going to cover any of those. This was really strictly supposed to be React, although truthfully, in its latest version, I have decided to include some of this Toolchains stuff, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit, and we'll kind of talk about how to get started with some of the basics. All right, so enough of the introduction stuff. Let's just get right into React. So plain and simple, this is it right here, right? This is a React component. There's a class component at the top here, and there's the React DOM.render method there at the bottom. And we're going to talk about all this. We're going to bring all this together and talk about it one piece at a time and kind of break down what's going on here and see some examples. And at the end of this, we'll look at an actual React application that's running here. So throughout let me put this off to the side here. My WebEx is in the way. So throughout this, we'll cover things like class components. We'll cover things like component state. We'll take a look at component properties and talk about what those are for and how to use them. Talk about sub-elements, and then we'll talk about the React DOM class that provides some of the wire up for us to the front end. It's really broken down into 3 parts. We're going to talk about very briefly talk about modern JavaScript. React is ultimately just JavaScript when it comes down to it. That's all it is. Despite all the mixing and mingling of what looks like HTML, it's really just JavaScript. So we have to talk about modernizing JavaScript just a little bit, and then we'll spend the rest of the time talking about React and getting started with React and kind of where to go next. So as a backend dev, traditionally I have really not had a super positive view of JavaScript. I've used it. I get along with it. I get by with it. Maybe even I was good at it at some points. But when I think about JavaScript, I think here's some of the terms that come to mind. Right? It's a scripting language. I know that, right? It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's very dynamic. There's no type system necessarily built in. Everything's very, very dynamic. And it's always changing, right? JavaScript now iterates every year. There's a new release, essentially, of ECMAScript. It's also kind of messy because of that. I feel like as a traditional statically typed backend developer who likes the compilers, this interpreted language is it's weird to me sometimes. Frameworks, there's tons and tons of frameworks. There's, we're still living a time when JavaScript has a new framework released, it seems like every month. Everyone wants to reinvent the wheel. Semicolons are everywhere, but and yet nowhere. They're entirely optional, which again, it's that dynamic nature of the language and the interpreter. And then my least favorite part of JavaScript, if you're writing modern JavaScript today, you have to basically use Node. It's very hard to avoid. It can be done, but it's just not typically done. So not my favorite thing about JavaScript. That said, it has been around for a while, so we have to acknowledge that. The very, very brief history of it, right? JavaScript was released in 95 originally. It was standardized in 97. We had a bunch of releases of ECMAScript, with the standard behind JavaScript. And then around 99, 2000, we kind of got this ECMAScript 3 version that really formed the basis of JavaScript that we built the modern web on. So we have, about 10 years roughly where this ubiquitous version of JavaScript came out that built things like, allowed things like jQuery, Gmail, that very Ajax-y interactive experience. And then in the last, since about 2009 and more recently 2015, JavaScript was iterated on again and modernized to kind of fix some of the classic problems that were introduced way back when in the 90s. So today, we actually have a whole bunch of other versions as well. I mean, it's like I said, it's iterated on every year now. So there's lots and lots of new features to keep up with, kind of a mess. For the sake of learning React, we really, really, really only care about all this modern kind of ES5 and ES6 stuff. So some of the topics I'm going to talk about and some of the things you're going to see in code fall into this realm. Again, I've been building applications for so long that I really started back in that 97, 98 era. So it was very difficult for me to kind of modernize and learn some of these newer features of JavaScript, but it's definitely required. A few of the concepts that I found most helpful that I definitely lacked coming into this exercise. Variable scoping has changed quite a bit in JavaScript. So the let keyword, the const keyword, these are basically ways of scoping variables to local functions rather than that kind of universal var global type. Arrow function expressions rather. This is basically just a shorthand notation for writing functions in JavaScript. So very similar to other languages. If you use fat arrow functions in C#, it's basically the same thing. Just essentially just a short way of writing functions. There's some other quirks there and rules around that, but essentially that's pretty much the best example I can give. Promises. So promises are a whole topic in and of themselves. Shortest way to describe these it's essentially a way of doing asynchronous function calls in JavaScript, where you can either succeed or you can fail. So there's this chaining method and .catch. I would, of all the concepts we're going to talk about today, promises are where we could certainly spend the most time, but I'm not going to go into those in great detail. And then modules. So JavaScript does support modules. There's a bunch of different module standards. And you don't have to worry about the specifics of each different standard, like AMD, UMD, and require and all that. You really just need to know that JavaScript does support modules. There's a bunch of different flavors, and the idea is the same between all of them. It allows you to take a single file of JavaScript and break down different functions and spread across different files. So you can modularize how you use your code and where you consume what. And it really helps you clean up larger applications. The only other concept then from modern JavaScript, this is an ES5 concept. It's actually, I think, refined in ES6, is classes. So classes are the one construct of modern JavaScript that you definitely need to kind of wrap your head around in order to help understand React better. So let's look at a class. This is a JavaScript class. You use the class keyword to start it. This is just a person. Every JavaScript class has one and only one constructor, which gets called when the class gets instantiated, and that allows you to just kind of set up some, set up whatever work you need to do, whatever variables you might need to establish right from the get-go. Classes also support functions, so you can write a nice, quick, simple function like this to do some work. And making use of that function is really, syntactically speaking, very similar to how you would in other languages like C#. It's really just instantiate your, new up your object and do all the things you'd expect to do with kind of a traditional statically bound class. So quite simple, I hope. Inheritance also is supported. So if you take a class like teacher, you can extend it from person. Same thing, it has a constructor. You can set up all your initial variables. The only other thing to keep in mind is that when you extend a class, you also have this super method that you can call in the constructor. I think it's actually required in certain situations. I'm not sure what the rules are. I'll double check that, but you can basically call the parent constructor with super, instantiate the things you need to do, and then go on from there. You're going to see that when we get into React classes, this syntax is used all over the place. So you're going to see a lot of it. So with that, we'll switch over and get into some React basics. Okay. So if I told you to build a component library, a component system, if I just gave you an HTML file, if I gave you a JavaScript file and I said, go build a component system from scratch, just go build reusable components. How would I do that? Like, I don't even know where to begin, quite honestly. There's certainly some ways I would approach it, but more importantly, there's some things I would want to consider. What are some of the core concerns of that components have to worry about? Things like state management, handling events. How does a component trigger an event so that other components can be aware of it? Dispatching updates, right? Like sending updates out across the chain of components. How do we handle that? How do we provide interactivity? How do we render components? How does a component, once it's updated, get rendered? There's a lot to it, right? Like when you really dig, I could sit here and probably do a whole presentation on just designing component systems, but when you get into it, these things have been solved for you by React. That's kind of the whole point. React solved these things for you, so you don't have to think about them as long as you do them the React way. So fundamentally, React is a library. It's not a framework. This is kind of key. Frameworks imply a larger set of functionality. Typically, frameworks provide things like routing and other update tooling and larger state management maybe. But really, React is just a library for building components with JavaScript. That's it. A better way to think about it is React provides the provides the definition for drawing borders around components. So it helps it gives you guardrails. What is a component? React defines all that for you. And I'll break that down here in a second. Second thing to know, it's been around for a while. React has been around since, 2013 or so. Facebook originally wrote it and released it, and now it's maintained by a combination of Facebook and the dev community. So there's the usual politics involved, but it's definitely a very active live thing. In fact, React 18 was just released a couple weeks ago, so it's very much an actively developed, maintained library. So having been a backend developer for 15 plus years, why did I decide to finally learn React over some of the other options out there? Well, first and foremost, I like my tooling well supported. and well documented and stable, and that's exactly what React is. It's been around for a while. It's not going anywhere. It's actively being worked on. There's documentation, blogs, whatever. You can find answers to just about any question. And really, once you learn React, this is kind of the stepping stone to some other tooling. So once you learn some of the component architecture problems being solved by React, you'll learn that that's a common pattern that's being solved by other tooling. So you can get a head start on things like Vue and Angular and whatnot, just to kind of at a conceptual level. It provides the best support when you're really building multi-component interfaces, single-page applications, in other words. That's really where React shines the most, I think. But there are other ways to use React, and we're going to talk about those here in a minute. Why would I not recommend using React? If you're primarily a back-end team and you don't have any Fed experience at all, any front-end development, that could be a problem. Right? Like production-ready React does require a lot of complex tooling, I think. Node transpiling, bundling, there's a whole bunch to it. We're going to talk about it here. But it does help to have some Fed experience who knows their way around those tools when you're writing production-ready applications. So I would definitely make sure you have at least one member on your team who's proficient. And definitely don't use React if you're building primarily content-driven sites and you want those to be just React applications. If you build a single-page application that's mostly content, it's not going to be indexed by search engines quite the same as if it was a static site coming down or it was server-driven components. So there are ways around this, and we'll talk about those here in a minute too. But yeah, don't build single-page applications that are just content, because a single-page application is really supposed to be something that's functional, like a banking application. Again, we'll talk about static site generation and server-side rendering here in a little bit too, and how those solve some problems. So what can be a component? Anything, okay? Anything can be a component, but a React application ends up being really just a hierarchy of components. So at the very top level, you typically will have an app, and this will be your primary React. This will be a React component that wraps everything else on the page, right? Inside of the app, you have a header component. You might have a filters component, a search results component, your paging controls. Whoops, your search results. Each of these things might be a component, and it's really just a tree of components that builds each piece of this. You can use React in a bunch of different places, and I'm going to break this down to really just three ways to write React and utilize it. And we'll actually see the live demo I have at the end of this is very indicative of this example here. So you can use React in the browser. In other words, you can include the React library, the React DOM library. You can provide a transpiler like Babel. You can include your code all in the browser, and it works. Everything runs in the browser. Everything compiles in the browser. You can have a completely functional application like this. Very simple to write, very easy, very, very, very quick to get started. The code I'm going to give at the end of the presentation is actually using this method, and it takes 30 seconds to set this up. It's very, very simple. Downside though is that it's not very performant. You're essentially asking React to do all of the transpiling in the user's browser on the fly. It's not the ideal way to deliver an application, but it is a great way to learn and get started. So that's what we're going to do. You can also use React as a bundle, and this is probably the most common production-ready version of React app delivery. So a developer writes their application, they write it against the React library, DOM, and they use Babel and other tools. They write their code, and they take all that and they bundle it up, stick it through some back-end tooling, Node and Webpack and a bunch of other things. And what they do is they spit out a single bundled file of JavaScript. This is optimized for production. It's compressed. It's ready to go. Instead of serving 5 different React files, you have one, and it's your entire application ready to go on the front end. I'd say most React applications are delivered like this. Advantages: performance and load size. It's the way you want to do it. Downside: there's a lot of upfront configuration, and there really is a lot of tooling involved. There doesn't have to be, but when you start looking at all the different pieces of the React toolchain that we'll show here in a minute, it can be a little overwhelming for for folks like me who came from the back end. Finally, you can also use React on the server, which kind of brings us full circle back to being a backend developer, right? Developer writes code, they include all their libraries, they write their code, they bundle all that up, but it doesn't go down to the client. Instead, on a live, like server running node, you actually compile your components, render them, and then spit out and serve HTML and just JavaScript essentially. So you're building your web page on the server and then delivering that to the browser, which is very, very, very performant. This is the kind of where we are right now with React, bringing it back to the server, rendering things there, and then spitting out HTML. There's a lot less JavaScript to load for the user, so the performance is much better and the experience is traditionally better. Downside is we're back to maintaining backend servers, so we definitely have to maintain a live, high-performance server to be able to handle that load. Talking about Toolchains then, like I've been saying, there's a bunch of things to consider. What needs to happen as part of a React toolchain? You're writing code here and you need to deliver it to the browser. There's a bunch of stuff that happens in between. That's what toolchains are all about. One of those things is you have to transpile your code or compile. Really, I think transpile is the more proper word. So you write what's called JSX, JavaScript extensions, and React code, and you have to transpile that to JavaScript at some point. You have to bundle things together. So you're going to have 100 files in your source. You need to bring those together into 1 or 2 JavaScript files. You probably should use a linter, because if you're writing just JavaScript versus, say, TypeScript, you do want to be able to have some of that built-in back-end type checking before the code goes out. So you want to be able to make sure you're writing code that passes certain tests and is valid syntactically. Unit testing needs to be considered. Styling needs to be considered. So if you're writing a web app, you probably have a front-end designer. You have front-end code. You have styling. You have style sheets. Maybe it's Sass. Maybe it's less. I don't know. Point is, there's a lot to consider. And this is where that front-end experience does kind of come into play. So example of some tool chains then. So if you're writing truly just for the client and you want to deliver everything down to the client, you don't need much. You just need to write your JavaScript, your HTML, and maybe include Babel so you can transpile it on the browser. If you're writing a traditional app, you get Node, Webpack involved, maybe Sass and Less in some of their bundlers as well. If you're writing just on the server, if you're writing React that is intended to just be executed on the server, this is where Next.js comes into play. And I'm sure we'll talk about that here in a little bit. If you just want to generate static pages, you want to write React and then have it generate a single complete web page, tools like Gatsby can do that. That's where you have those static sites like a blog or something that some folks tend to use. All right, so what we'll do now is kind of get into some examples and go through some actual code. One thing to say here, this is all based on an earlier version of React. So like I said, React 18 just came out a few weeks ago, and it did make a few changes that are slightly different from the code you're going to see here. Also, back in React 16, they introduced hooks, which I'm going to talk about a little bit here, but we're not going to see that. So everything we're going to see today is based on class functions, which you can still use today. It's okay to write class functions. Most code that you might interact with, existing code, probably are written in class functions as it is. But just know that some newer versions of React 16, 17, and 18 have started to kind of get away from class components, but that's okay. I consider class components to still be the basis of React, and they provide the most functionality and the most flexibility still. All right, so let's look at a hello world example, and let me know if any of this doesn't come through. I can probably zoom in, but it should be big enough. So here's a hello world example of actual React code. So here's a web page. For the sake of examples, I'm just including 3. This is what the client-side version of this would look like, right? We have React development JavaScript files, and we have Babel there to provide transpiling. We have a route. We need to be able to render a React application somewhere to the page. This is the target. This is where the components are going to be rendered to. And then we have a script tag. Now you'll notice the type here is text Babel, not text JavaScript. That's because what we're writing inside the script tag isn't actually going to be pure JavaScript. It's actually going to be JSX, JavaScript extensions. That's a React-specific way of writing code. So we're going to have this go through the Babel transpiler before it gets actually sent, rendered onto the page. And then this is it. This is the simplest version of a React application I can possibly think of. So React DOM.render is the entry point for most applications. This is one of those things that changed in 18, but I digress. That's not a big deal right now. So React DOM.render has two components to it. It has an element. It has what we want to render. In this case, we're going to output an H1. And then it has a container. This is the target. This is where it's going to render to. So we'll see that this is, and I'm going to pull out my pointer here. So we see that this has a pointing to the root here, so it's going to render out to this div, and it's going to insert an H1, and that's exactly what we expect to get. That's what we would get in the browser, plain and simple. So I talked a little bit about JSX, JavaScript extensions. It's also been called JavaScript something else. I can't think of the name off the top of my head. There's a couple different meanings behind it, but really it's just this format. JSX lets you mix markup with JavaScript code where they look one and the same. And it's a little confusing. This is the thing that got me when I first started learning React. I couldn't figure out how in the heck you're able to mix these things together, but that's what JSX is. So even though this looks like JavaScript for the most part, it's not. It just looks like JavaScript. It's actually a different language, right? It's JSX. So in this example, we're assigning an H1 element with our content with an area label to this JSX element. You can do the exact same thing without using JSX. You could write this in pure JavaScript. You just have to use a React method. React.createElement would do the exact same thing, and it takes 3 parameters. It takes our tag type, it takes our attributes, and it takes our content. If I was to render both of these elements out, I would get basically the same thing, right? These both work. The reason we use JSX is because when you start writing complex components, it's better to see that it's better to see the markup closer to what it's supposed to look like, and it's just a little easier to parse than having a big stack of these functions. This could get real messy after a while. So JSX is definitely worth learning. So React does support expression. So let's take a dog name, like my dog Lizzie. Let's go ahead and stick that in our render method, and we use curly braces on each side of this. That lets us just insert that variable there, plain and simple. Not much to it. So we talked about function syntax and class syntax. There's essentially 2 ways to write components in React. You can do it with a function. So I can create a function, hello world, and I return whatever I want my function to output. So here I'm returning an H1, and I can pass that function into the render method, my React DOM render method, and it does what you'd expect. It outputs that H1 tag. Same thing with a class. So again, I said this is where we're going to be focusing on classes from here on out. This is where you get the most flexibility in terms of building complex components. So we have a class, in this case, animal. It always extends from React.component when you're writing a component class. The React.component class provides a lot of the core functionality that we're going to need to write complex components. So we have an animal. You always have to have a render method in your class component. This render method is what React looks for to know what to output, what to render. So we have a render method that, again, just like our function method, returns some markup, essentially. So we're going to output an H1. We pass in this class using this kind of XML-like syntax. So we pass in the animal here as our element, and we'll get to this in a minute and see why we write it like this. And we're going to extend on, we're going to expand this and extend it. This does exactly what we expect. React DOM.render loads the animal component. It looks for the render method on it, and it renders whatever was returned. Hello world. So component properties, we're going to talk about properties and state. So far, we've looked at the simple ways to just render content out. Now we want to do something with data or content or settings or whatever. So let's say we have a component and we have data, content, settings that we want to get into that component. Properties do that for us. Properties are a one-directional way of sending information into a component. This is read-only data. So once it goes into the component, you can't modify it. Via properties, you can pass in more properties, or you can overwrite the property and send it into the component. But once it's in the component, it's read-only. So let's take a person class and with our render method, right? So here's our render method, and we are accessing these properties. Now, properties, this props variable is available to us through the React.component. So that's kind of provided as a freebie there. We don't have to declare that necessarily strictly, but we have a first name we're passing in here. In our render method, on our element, we can pass in attributes, what looks like an attribute, right? And these are our properties. So in this case, I'm passing in last name, and then the person class sees that and tries to render it. Now, in this example, there is a problem. It actually doesn't work because there's a mismatch. So, and that's okay. React doesn't complain about that. Had this been first name here, it would have showed hello Brandon. But that's okay. If the property doesn't exist, React just ignores it and doesn't do anything. It's not going to throw an error. But yeah, properties are a way for you to pass data into a component. Component state. So components don't just exist in a moment. They exist over time. Typically, a component would probably exist on a page for some X number of minutes or hours or whatever, right? As the user interacts with an application, things are going to change. State allows you to manage data and content and settings inside of a component. So you can send them in with properties, but you can't modify them. State lets you modify things. So instead of sending data and content and settings into a component, you can manage them in a component, and these are only managed by a component. So other components can't see state of other components. That's very important to keep in mind, but not critical for this discussion. Take a class building, and here's our constructor. There's our super. Inside the constructor, you can establish state. So again, state is provided via the React.component base class here. And you can assign an object to state. So we can have floors, we can have a price. In this case, the price actually comes in through the props variable. So we're setting it, kind of initializing initial state is what that really is doing. And then we have our render method in our class. So this is what the component's going to look like. We're going to output the number of floors. We're going to output the value of the building. And then in our render method, we set the building up and we pass in that price. So here's our price, $225. And you'll see that comes in as a prop, props.price. We assign it to the state. And then in our render method, we are going to access that state and output that price. So there's definitely a little flow to how that's working there. And when we execute that, there we go. We see our 4 floors and we see our price. If you need to update state, it's not something you do directly. Yes, you could access this.state.floors and update it, but you don't want to do it that way because one of the React handles update propagation for you. So there is a special method to be used, and it's called setState. So this.setState, it's a method available in that React.component class that allows you to update any state variables that exist or create new state variables if they don't exist. So you could update the number of floors, update the price of that building by just passing in some variables, pass them into setState as an object, and that does what you'd expect. Updates the state. Key takeaway, right? Props versus state. This is a pretty fundamental React concept to learn. So my introduction is very, very quick, but hopefully it gives you enough of a taste that you can read more about it. Props data flows into a component. It's read-only, and it's really for initializing values and setting initial state, as opposed to state, which is managed strictly inside of a component and is initialized in the constructor. Okay, let's talk events. This is a lot of code, and it looks like it looks more complex than it is. The basics here is that you can provide a class with functionality, and you can access that functionality on your front end. So like if you have a button, for example, where you need to handle a click or handle a text input update, you can assign functionality to your UI and point it to methods on your class. So here I have a start party and end party method on these buttons, basically pointing to these methods in my class. Simple as that. There's a little more ceremony you have to do with class components, and there's ways around this, but you have to just deal with some binding. I won't go into that detail, but I did include it here so you can see it. Just has to do with how this gets bound in JavaScript, and it's kind of it's one of those pain points React developers kind of moan about, but honestly, it's not the end of the world. The real key takeaway here is, yes, you can bind events to objects in your markup, and you can access those through events. So I'm going to render this party out, this party component, and when I do that, I click the start the party button, and you get that alert, just as you'd expect. There are some lifecycle methods available on React.component. So component did mount, component will unmount, and there's a bunch of others. There's about a half dozen, maybe more, component lifecycle methods. These are overrides essentially. So these are available via React.component, and these are different methods that fire off at different points in the component lifecycle. In this case, when the component gets mounted onto the page and it's built into the DOM, this method fires. Component will unmount gets called when a component's removed from the page. So if I was to go ahead and render out this component, you'll get that message, component is mounting, that first function up here. You'll notice that nothing's been drawn yet behind it. So this gets called right when that component's mounted to the DOM, but before it gets displayed. So the React documentation has a really good explanation of all the lifecycle methods, and it's pretty easy to find that. So I definitely encourage you to go learn what's out there. You typically will use something like component did mount to load data in, for example. If you have a component that needs to pull data from a server, that would be something that you maybe do there, for example. If you need to tear down some things or send some alerts or messages somewhere else as a component comes off a page, you could do that in component will unmount. All right, so those are the core concepts I wanted to go over. We'll dive into a couple of demos here real quick, and then we'll go to Q&A. Taking what we put together so far, this is a very basic sample React application, right? So the first takeaway here is that this class app is actually a React component itself. It has a constructor, it has a render method, and then it has a bunch of markup that does some stuff. Inside that render method, it's just returning, or it's calling other components. So there's a header component here, there's a filters component, there's a search results, there's a paging component, kind of like that example we saw earlier graphically. We're passing in properties. We have a title and a type going to the header. Nothing for the filters, and search results, we're passing in some other data, and so on and so forth. This is really just all React applications are. It's a series of components on a hierarchy to build up whatever functionality and structure you need. Some other things to learn. Definitely learn about lifting state. Component refs are kind of handy, but not entirely necessary most of the time. Writing HTML attributes in markup can be a little weird. So let me go back to the slide here. If you were to, for example, put a class on this div right here, you can't just put div class as you'd expect, because again, you're not writing HTML here. This is actually JavaScript, which is the hardest thing for me to wrap my head around. There's actually, it's not div class, it's actually div class name over here. So there's some quirks there that if you're familiar with HTML, you have to kind of relearn some of that for JSX. But there's some really good references out there. Hooks are worth learning as well. React 16, 17, 18, hooks were introduced and they're still being refined, but hooks allow you to essentially write components without using classes, and still let you have things like state. But I definitely suggest learning classes first and getting good at those before you move on to hooks. Okay, so real quick, I wanted to switch over and do let's see, pull this up real quick. I did have a little demo I wanted to go through very, very quickly, and I'm gonna pull that up. Let's see. And I should have had this up beforehand. I do apologize. There it is. So I have you'll have access to this too if you want to go play with it. This is a React demo application I wrote specifically for this presentation and as a learning tool. So the actual demo here, let me pull this up. So this is a complete React application. We have a bunch of components. This header at the top is actually a component. This filter box is a search filter by name is a component. This rating control is a component. This clear button is a component. This list and each of these cards are components. You can see some of the reusability at play here, right? We can see each of these cards is a single component with data passed in, right? We set the title, we set the type, the length, so on and so forth. It's very interactive, it works well. If I look at the page source behind this, there's nothing there. It's a very simple application. Like I said before, I'm pulling in all the things I need to do all this on the client, so it's very, very, very simple to write. There's my root where my application starts, and then I have a bunch of components here that I'm loading into the page, including things like the app. So this is my kind of core application here, and this might actually probably be better to show off over here in GitHub where I see the structure a little bit here. Here's my application, my app component, which provides things like I have some state where I set up my trail data, essentially the data I'm pulling in here. I have a lifecycle method component did mount, so when this thing gets loaded, I go out and I get some data, some JSON data that comes in. I have some events here where I handle a type ahead. When that changes, go off and do something, right? When some filters get updated, go off and do something, update some state, update some data. I have a reset method. I have reset all the filters. And then I get down to my render method. And this is where the structure of the app really comes together. So my render method returns a bunch of markup and other components. So I have a title component with some properties where I set the title. I have my filters. There's my type ahead filter. There's my ratings filter, and with a bunch of properties that I pass in. There are some things going on here like the type ahead change. So you can actually pass a function as a property, and that kind of lets you have some two-way communication somewhat. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but that is something you can do via properties. And then eventually I have my list of trails. So I have I'm looking at, in my state, I have some trail data here, and I'm just iterating over that, outputting some list items and outputting a series of these trails. And as I update my state in this component, this data list gets updated, and this list gets re-rendered, and you get that functionality that you're seeing over here. The rest of the components are pretty simple, and I won't spend too much time on them, right? The title component is just, there's a class here, and there's a constructor that doesn't do anything, and I just output an H1 with whatever properties were passed in. So I have the text, and I have the alignment. Some of the more complex ones, maybe like the trail, I think, well, this is pretty straightforward, I guess. Here's the structure for the trail detail, the actual card. There's a trail name, there's the image, and all the stats. So pretty simple. If you want this, and I'll send you the link here in a moment, you can start with this just to play with it. You can you can clone this repo and stick it on a web server locally, and it works. You can play with it, you can tweak it, you can kind of start with what you learned here and extend it from there. I have a couple of resources here as well that I used. And then finally, if you want to get a little more complex, I also have a complete tool chain example that gives you a starting point to build production-ready apps. So more or less, this gets you started with Node and Webpack, so you can start building bundled React applications from scratch. And it tells you how to get started here. It also gives you step-by-step of how this was set up in the first place in case you ever want to recreate that or learn. And there's some example links to take you to some other resources that I worked with. So that is it. That's the core of the application and the demo. I'm on Twitter. If you have any questions, you can go to GitHub, and there's the repositories that I just showed. You can email me if you have any questions as well, and there's a QR code that takes you to the same place on GitHub. So questions, comments?
So we have one question in the chat. I'll just narrate it to you. So while
Sure.
working with React with Sitecore, headless one, how do we handle site search functionality as traditionally we were using Solar library in traditional .NET MVC application? Does React has any NPM or node package with which we can implement search functionality?
Um, Not there's nothing natively built that I'm aware of right now. There's short answer is no that I know of. I'm sure somebody's built something that but that would really just be an exercise in wiring up components to backend search services and maybe even having to write those services, right? React doesn't really aim to be React, the library, doesn't really try to fill in specific types of functionality. It's really just about providing that component structure that lets you build the components you need for the front end. So the back end pieces like wiring up to search still needs to be done. But there's no packages available that I'm aware of. But again, there might be out there. I just have to go look.
Second question coming in is how we manage security stuff in React.
Was that security?
Yeah,
You said?
how we manage security stuff in React. Maybe it's login functionality. If
Mm-hmm. It wouldn't be any different than how you do it with JavaScript because again, React's just JavaScript. Um, if it's you do it the same way you would any front end application, which means the first thing you have to understand is never trust the front end, right? Never trust the client ever. All your security routines, all of your validations, all of your logins, all of your password checks, all that stuff happens on the back end and securely, hopefully, right, over HTTPS. Um, so there really is no magic bullet to like how to do it in React per se, but from a JavaScript point of view, don't expose API keys to JavaScript, right? Um, Generally speaking, when you transact with a server securely, like let's say you need to access a secure resource, there's temporary tokens issued, right? Like so you go to the server, you say, hey, here's my credentials over an HTTPS connection, right? Here's my user's credentials. Give me a token. That token comes back, and yes, that exists on the client, but very temporarily, right? And it's really just about passing tokens around. So if you've heard of JWTs, right? JSON Web Tokens, that's that's all that is. Is it JSON Web Tokens? Yeah. It's really that's the concept you kind of want to look into, and it's just there's some best practices there for handling that.
Thank you, Brendan.
Yep.
Last but not least, we have next question is how do we set up multi-site with React?
That's a bigger question than I think this presentation entails, but if you're talking specific, like, is the question specifically focused on Sitecore maybe? Is it like,
Yes.
how would you get started? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
Uh,
so. It will be related to site.
I figured, yeah. That's less of a React question and more of a Sitecore question. So if you're talking, and it depends on what you're doing here. So I can't speak to the Next.js stuff because I'm still kind of learning that as right now actively learning that. And I could answer that question better in a few months probably. But if you're talking like JSS headless stuff, that's more of a JSS configuration exercise than it is a React specific exercise because again, you're just using React to build the components that your site needs. There is documentation in the JSS docs for doing that, and I don't have it in front of me here, but I could send that link out, and I can tweet that link out afterwards, and let you know. But that's a specific question to JSS specifically, which I just don't have the answer in front of me. So, Sitecore.
Yes, I think yeah. It's
Yeah,
very difficult.
I'll try to get an answer and tweet about it here in a little bit, and get you get some good information there. Here we go.
Another just came in, which is very React specific. Is React deprecating class-based components?
That's it. Now that's a good question. Officially, no. They are not. Their official stance is no. We are not deprecating class-based components, and that's good because, quite frankly, I don't think they need to. Um, the reason they introduced hooks as a way of writing they introduced hooks as an alternative to writing class-based components. So in other words, instead of writing class-based components that have state and all these events and stuff, you can do the same thing by using hooks in a function component. Now, a function component does not inherit from React.component, that big heavy class, and that's exactly the point. React.component is a very big, very heavy class that brings a lot of code and a lot of performance, potential performance issues along with it when you start building really, really big applications. So they figured, well, hey, we introduced hooks. It's a lightweight way of accessing some of that same functionality in a function. They're not deprecating class components, and they're not even saying you need to start writing, stop writing them, for example. I'm looking for the line here that I saw in their documentation about it, but you can write class components today. I would recommend you learn class components just like I showed today, because you're going to see code in production that is class-based, and it's still useful for certain types of components as it is. So the answer is no, they're not going to be deprecating that.
Okay, thank you. Let me
Yep.
share my screen. So
Sure,
we are done with the question and answers. So what's next? We would like to thank each and everyone who is on the call. Thank you for sharing your valuable time with us. Also, we would like to thank our speaker, Brandon, for sharing his knowledge and experience on React with us this evening. We are planning one more webinar in this month, which is on Docker containers solving the mystery by Rob Riley on 20th May. So stay tuned. You can find more details on the event page of SUG Pune website. Do follow us on social media channels. You can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. You can find the details on our screen as well at the moment. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend ahead.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you,
Wonderful.
everyone.
Yeah. Thanks, Brendan. Thanks, everyone.
Yep,
Happy
you're welcome.
weekend.
Thank you. Yep, have a good weekend.